Welcome back once again, everyone. Today we're going to be looking at the second part of this chapter about urbanization, about America's cities growing and the changes that brings, by talking just a little bit about urban culture and reform, and really what this is going to focus on, most of the true cultural things I'm going to not talk about right here and expect that you will read about them in your AMSCO book and perhaps even the textbook if that's available to you. Stuff about like mass entertainment and the circulation of magazines and newspapers and popularizing of Wild West shows and that sort of stuff, about some of the different literary movements like the realists and some of those things. None of that stuff I'm going to talk about here. I do want you to make sure you read over it. Mainly, we're going to talk about sort of how the urbanization affected families for just a moment. We're going to talk about how it changed women's roles here for a little bit and how that led to movements for change. We're not really so much getting to the changes themselves, because most of these reformers will find that they don't really get a whole lot of success, or really any success, as far as making changes to some of the things and the problems that they saw in America, particularly in regard to the cities and urbanization. Most of them will not see any real change until at least the Progressive Era. So we're just kind of seeing what some of the problems were and where some of these movements came from, and what some of these, or who some of these groups were, or who made up some of these groups that might have been pushing for reforms. And all this stuff we're going to continue to see as we move on forward, particularly as we get into the progressive movement a little bit later. One thing we do want to talk about it's not even so much that it's changing, it's just further evolving as a result of all of this, is education. So we're going to start with talking about public education and how that was continuing to grow in the later half of the 19th century, particularly with the growth of industrialization. We just see a continuation of those changes and attitudes about public education, that it was important. Now, if you think back to 10th grade, you learned how in the 30s and 40s, starting with Horace Mann, and partially because of the beginnings of industrialization in America, there became a greater sense, and it became more greatly accepted, that education was something that should be available to everyone, that it was not a right of just for the privileged, or it wasn't a privilege just for those people that were wealthy and could afford it, but that was something that was essential for Americans all over, that was essential for function in a democratic society, but furthermore, that it was essential for function in an industrialized society. Employers wanted to have workers that, had basic education, that could read and write, that increased worker productivity. They wanted workers that could do basic arithmetic. So we're not talking so much about, higher education here. We'll get to that in a moment. But public schools grew even more and continued to grow in the years following the Civil War. So this is, again, just a continuation of something that was already happening. It's just becoming even more widespread. But more and more states and local governments, counties and so forth, were establishing public schools. And when we say public school, remember that means for the masses and paid for by tax dollars, paid for by the people, tax supported. And we see that, of course, still more in the North and in the West than you do in the South. The South still lags behind, but there is certainly more of it, particularly a lot of growth and a lot of innovation when it came to elementary education and preschool education even. That was certainly goes hand in hand with the settlement house movement. Some of that was kind of all going together. And also the beginnings of kindergarten. That was something that came from Germany. That was starting to be adopted by some public school systems in America. So more children and more people having the opportunity to attend public school, more standardized curriculums, all the things that go with that. And that has the effect of increasing literacy by leaps and bounds in this particular time. And you'll read about how the things people were reading more of, and magazine circulation and all that kind of stuff goes hand in hand with it as well. there's particularly in public schools, there's an increase in secondary education, which is not higher education, but high schools. That is something that was growing particularly even more than it had been before the Civil War, and more education beyond, say, the fifth grade, more elective curriculums and that sort of thing was definitely a cultural aspect of all of this. There is also a growth in higher education happening in this period. By that we mean, education after high school, colleges, and so forth, both traditional universities, but also more trade schools, more technical schools, engineering schools, all of that. Some of that was because of that Moral Land Grant Act. You may remember we talked about during the Civil War, the law that provided money to states to fund agricultural colleges, mechanical colleges, to encourage education in agriculture and engineering and things like that. So you see way more of that kind of stuff. So it's not just traditional colleges where you would study law and Latin and Greek and things like that, but where people would study, mechanical drawing, and would study, agricultural things, agronomy and soils and husbandry and that sort of stuff, to improve education in lots of different fields. There are more medical schools being established in this period. And while college education and higher education is still probably something that wasn't obtainable or even necessary for most Americans, it was certainly becoming more widely available. And there was certainly a growth in that in this era. And all of that, again, in response to industrialization, people wanting to be able to be more educated and wanting to have a more educated workforce in order to encourage that economic development and encourage that economic growth. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the South definitely lags behind when it comes to public education. They had before the Civil War, as they, one, were so rural, it made that more difficult logistically, but certainly didn't want to pay for it and didn't have the tax revenues to pay for it, and also because of the issues of race and concerns in the South over, well, we don't want to educate slaves or freed African Americans once slavery has ended, all of that. But we do want to talk about some leaders, very important leaders in the fight for African American education and the fight for African American rights, which of course we know were extremely diminished in both the North and South at this particular point. Probably the biggest champion of African American education during this period is Booker T. Washington, who is this guy right here. And I bet a lot of you recognize his name or maybe have studied about him before. And I wanted to take a little bit more time to talk about Booker T. Washington and his contemporary W.E.B. DuBois, because this is, for us, partially Alabama history as well as being American history, so we want to spend a little bit more time on it. Booker T. Washington, again, probably the biggest advocate for African American education, but also advocating for a particular type of African American education and encouraging African Americans to obtain certain things and certain rights, and for that he was often quite criticized. Booker T. Washington was born a slave and had acquired education himself, and then goes into teaching and eventually starts Tuskegee. That's what at the time and for a long time was called the Tuskegee Institute. Most of you probably recognize that today as Tuskegee University, not too far from here, just down the road a bit. And Tuskegee Institute started out as a vocational school for African American students. The idea being, and the kind of education that that Booker T. Washington was advocating for, and what he created Tuskegee for, this was not a higher education like learning philosophy and science and mathematics and those kind of things. Tuskegee Institute, and a lot of schools like it, other schools that would be inspired by Tuskegee and start similar programs. This was about agricultural education, industrial education, to train African Americans in better farming skills and mechanical skills that would get them good factory work or some other kind of manual labor in the domestic arts. He was encouraging African Americans to become employable, become economically independent. That was the phrase that he used. He said, it's not about going and getting your law degree. It's not about going and getting your literature degree and getting a PhD and becoming a white-collar professional. He said specifically that African Americans should be striving for blue-collar jobs, should be working to be factory workers or mechanics or plumbers or domestic servants like maids and child caregivers and seamstresses and stuff like that, shopkeepers and so forth. And that was the kind of education that Tuskegee Institute specialized in. Booker T. Washington, I don't know why I want to keep calling him the wrong name. Booker T. Washington, when it came to rights and the position that African Americans were in as far as a complete lack of rights, particularly in the South, Booker T. Washington said that African Americans should not be seeking those things just yet. He said, this is kind of what we need to do first. We need to get these kinds of jobs, be able to get a good paying job, make some wages, buy a house, raise a family, be prosperous, and, become economically independent. Again, there's that phrase, be able to support ourselves. And then later, perhaps who knows how much later, maybe generations later, then we'll be able to strive for those other things. He was specifically saying, don't ask for the right to vote right now. Don't ask for full equality right now. We have to take these sort of baby steps first. And first of all, on a side note, if you're wondering, no, Tuskegee is no longer a school where you would just go to learn how to be a good farmer or how to be a seamstress. It is a full-scale university, of course, now with the same kinds of programs you could find in many major universities today. And you can see how Booker T. Washington received perhaps a lot of praise for the things that he said. He also received a great deal of criticism for the things that he said, and you can certainly imagine why. There are plenty, including his contemporary here that we're about to talk about, W.E.B. DuBois, that heavily criticized Washington and people that agreed with him, calling him an accommodationist. And by accommodationist, they meant you're accommodating to what essentially the white people want you to say. You're saying the things that white people are going to like and what white America wants to hear, that no, we don't want voting rights now. We got to do this first. We need to pull ourselves up and be independent and do a good job and all this, and then we'll ask for those things later on. Whereas people like, for example, W.E.B. Du Bois said, absolutely not. We should be working for the highest education we can possibly get, and we should be receiving rights now. We shouldn't have to wait on them. We shouldn't have to prove ourselves of anything. We should be getting voting rights and rights to enter college and well-paying jobs and political office and that upward mobility, all those things. We should be getting that now. So that you can see how the two easily collided with each other. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was not born into slavery, he was the very first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard. And so you can see how his view of education, having received, Ivy League education, greatly contrasted with Booker T. Washington. So Du Bois was probably the biggest voice for full equality, full educational equality, economic equality, social equality, political equality, completely disagreeing with Booker T. Washington, saying we should not have to wait for those things. We shouldn't have to work for those things. We are entitled to those things right now. And he very much disagreed with this idea that you should only get this kind of education and you should only work for these kind of jobs and just wait on the rest of the stuff to happen later. Du Bois and several other African-American intellectuals become the founding members. He's not the only person that starts this. There were several others, but he founds an organization which some of you will probably recognize because it does still exist, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which you most likely have heard by its abbreviation, the NAACP. And this is a legal organization that would begin work here in the late 19th century to improve the condition for African Americans, filing lawsuits and petitions and so forth. And then, of course, we'll talk a lot about the actions of the NAACP, particularly as it pertains to the civil rights movement when we get to that. And they are still involved in, taking things to court and demonstrate all kinds of things to improve, acting usually on the legal behalf of people that feel that racial discrimination has affected them. So African-American education is being advocated by both of these individuals, but a totally different view of what that ought to look like and what it ought to lead to. Now, again, reform, there's, of course, lots of changes. We've looked at lots of changes and we've looked at lots of problems that come from those changes. We know that these cities, as glittery and dazzling as they could be terrible for some people, that poor people are living in squalor. We know that people are, not treated fairly. Workers are working long hours. We know that there's all kinds of social problems that are brought about by industrialization. Some of those problems had been there before that. Some of them have been magnified because of that. And so we want to talk for just a minute about sort of the groundwork that starts to be laid here in the late 19th century for people to start questioning those things and more importantly, to start working to try to change them, to demand some kind of action to say, this needs to be addressed. We need to stop this thing or fix that or help these people, so forth and so on. First, let's talk a little bit about how urbanization had affected particularly family relationships and how it affected the role of women, because women play such a huge role in the reform movements to try to counteract and fix a lot of these problems. So urban life had certainly changed the whole family structure, and a lot of this so much depends on socioeconomic status, but particularly for people of middle to lower class, really more lower class, working class families. Industrialization meant that everybody's working outside the home. The home is, not where people spend their day. And that puts a lot of strain on a lot of families. And relationships are harder to maintain. Women are working outside of the home more. Children, we know that child labor was a problem in these days. So it often meant children having to work instead of spending their childhood in school or playing and some of those things that children would typically do. Divorce rates increase in this era because of some of those strains. People are living more, they're closer together with other families, but the whole extended family, they might be more isolated from a lot of that. The birth rate decreases in this time period because having more children didn't mean more help around the house. It meant another mouth to feed. It meant another person you had to feed and clothe. And so the birth rate is decreasing. Marriages are being delayed. A lot of women, because they are working or don't want to have children because they can't support them, are delaying marriage and all of that. Some women are becoming more independent. Sometimes you will see, women being able to work and earn money and those kind of things. And that is somewhat true. Most of them probably not, the main breadwinners. And of course, unequal pay still doesn't happen. So it does mean some more independence and some higher standard of living for some. But again, it depends on who you're talking about. But it does put a lot of strain on families as well. And that growing independence of some women, particularly of middle class to upper class women, is partially what leads to some of these calls for reform. Because when you get people starting to say, this is wrong, we need to fix this, we need to stop that, we need to help these people, that oftentimes comes from, or almost always comes from, middle to upper class women that were more privileged and that weren't working outside the home, that weren't having to earn wages on their own. A lot of them felt themselves compelled to use their status and position to then try to bring attention to some of the problems that they saw. So that does lead to, and this is very, very similar. It's the exact same concept we saw in the reform movements that sprang up in the 1830s and 40s. It was overwhelmingly a presence of women in those reform movements, mostly middle to upper class women who felt themselves called to fix some of the things that they saw wrong with society. And the exact same thing is happening here. This is where we will actually see some of the same reforms from that time period, from the pre-Civil War time period, spring back up. We talked about then, in your 10th grade year, if you remember, that so many of these reform movements that were around in the 1830s and 40s eventually have to take a back seat to, if you remember, abolition. Remember, the slavery issue by 1850 had overshadowed things like women's rights and all that other stuff. Well, now that the slavery issue has been after the Civil War, that's no longer part of the national conversation. That means some of these other reform movements can kind of make a comeback. Plus, a lot of those problems have been magnified and have actually increased because of industrialization. So here we go with some of those problems. So because of this growing independence and women's involvement in so many other reform movements, this will eventually lead to the fight for women's rights, and particularly the fight for women's voting rights, having a resurgence in the 1880s and into the 1890s. We see established around 1890 or so the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which is a women's voting organization, and they're trying to encourage and trying to gain women's right to vote. Which, interestingly enough, this was actually started by some of the exact same women that were involved in Seneca Falls and all of that stuff back in the pre-Civil War era. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, you probably remember her. They were the founding members of this association, trying to bring about education, trying to push state legislatures and laws to change so that women could vote. And they do have some small success with that in the late 19th century. Some local governments, counties and so forth, will start allowing women to vote in local elections. elections. Western states were particularly more open to women's voting. Wyoming became the first one to allow women to vote in state elections. Of course, it will not be to the 20th century that we'll see women get the right to vote nationally, but that is a growing movement here. Now, interestingly enough, also about the women's suffrage movement this time around is their argument for why women should have the right to vote. It's not so much that it changes. I would say it kind of has a re-articulation. They sort of refocus. Before the Civil War, Seneca Falls and all of that, they focused on we have the right because that is inherent. If men have the right, we're the same as men. All men and women are created equal. They quoted the Declaration of Independence. They sort of built this argument as we are the same, and therefore we deserve the same rights. Interestingly enough, women at this time around are, it's not that they're not saying that, they're just de-emphasizing that. And they are saying that women should have the right to vote because women are different. They are embracing and making a connection between traditional women's roles and women's rights. They're saying we are caregivers and we are supposed to be mothers and we are supposed to be child rearers and we are supposed to take care of the home. And because of that, we are more intuitive. We are more adept at fixing social problems. That it's like they're saying you need women to vote because the problems of industrialization, the problems of the cities with child labor and people that are poor, women being more intuitive, being more nurturing, being more motherly, that women would better be able to fix those problems, that they could see things and understand things and find solutions for things like that better than men could. So they're really linking traditional women's roles to the right to vote and to further rights. And some people might have sympathized with that a lot more. So they are starting to make some progress here, but it will, of course, still be a while before they have full progress. And of course, that's a movement that still continues on. Another movement that you will see resurge after the Civil War, and it's closely related to the women's movement because it, again, overwhelmingly is women that are involved in it, and that's temperance. You probably remember temperance from 10th grade. That was the movement to limit or to ban alcohol. So this is not just hey, we talked about this before and we kind of had to stop for a while, so let's talk about it again. It is also a product of the changes that were taking place. We talked about the big wave of immigration. Culturally, a lot of those immigrants drank more, and so there was seemingly a big drinking problem. More public drunkenness and people in the cities that were poverty-stricken or disease-ridden. Alcoholism was a problem, partially because of immigration, partially because of probably just the stresses of factory work and some of those things. And so the Women's Christian Temperance Union is founded in the I want to say 1870s. I can't remember the exact year. It doesn't really matter. But there are other smaller groups like it. There's a similar group called the Anti-Saloon League, and they are doing some of the same things they were doing before the Civil War, trying to get governments to pass dry laws, to ban alcohol, to put limitations on it, to educate people about it, to try to get people to stop drinking and to limit alcohol. You're probably been wondering for the past 10 minutes or so who this lady is above me and why she is holding a hatchet. Her name is Carrie Nation. She was associated with the temperance movement, and she went on a campaign with her little hatchet when governments wouldn't listen and wouldn't do anything about alcohol. She would run around with this hatchet and go into saloons and bars and things and take that hatchet and like bust open all of the barrels of alcohol and rum and different things like that to get rid of it. So she was, kind of a little on the wild side there, as some of these women were. The temperance movement will continue to grow. Some of they will have some temporary total success in the 20th century with the passage of the 18th Amendment. We'll get to that a little bit later. And there are, of course, other kind of reforms that are springing up at this time as well. And so many of them, again, including women. So many of them are women's organizations, women's clubs, to try to, like the ASPCA, about animal cruelty, that's founded during this time. The Red Cross, you've got groups against child labor. You have groups against, we talked about the settlement houses and all of that. So there's all kinds of reforms that are being brought up during this period to try to address some of these problems. And all of that is eventually going to lead to a larger movement that we'll talk about soon called the progressive movement. We will finally see some of these reformers have at least some kind of lasting success. So we will be getting to that in a little bit.